The building was called the Birchwood, and it stood on the corner of 5th and Larkin, looking exactly the way Walter Ellis liked his buildings to look in photographs. Brick facade sandblasted back to a warm honey color, black steel balconies, a lobby with a chandelier that cost more than most of the unit's annual rent. Maren stood at the edge of the small crowd gathered for the ribbon cutting, in a blazer she'd bought for court appearances, watching her father hold a pair of oversized ceremonial scissors like a man who had never once in his life doubted that he deserved them. 25 years, Walter was saying into a microphone, and Ellis Realty Group has never cut a corner. Every building we touch with integrity. Maren's brother Caleb stood beside him in a suit that fit the way suits only fit men, who'd never had to buy one off a discount rack, beaming at the small crowd of investors and city council members like a man accepting an award he'd already written the speech for. Their mother, Diane, stood a step behind both of them, close enough to the microphone that she'd be in every photograph, far enough back that she'd never have to answer a question. Maren had not been invited to say anything. She hadn't expected to be. She'd come because her cousin Ivy, who did the company's permitting paperwork, and had been the one bright, honest spot in the family business for as long as Maren could remember, had asked her to, in a text that read only, "Please come, I need you to see this building," which was such an unusual thing for Ivy to say that Maren had cleared her afternoon without asking why. She found out why an hour later, in the building's mechanical room, where Ivy pulled a folded set of drawings from her bag and set them on top of a water heater, her hands not quite steady. "I wasn't going to show you this," Ivy said, "but I can't be the only one who's seen it." It was a structural certification for the Birchwood's cantilevered balconies, the kind of document that told the city, in the driest possible legal language, that a licensed professional engineer had reviewed the load calculations and confirmed the balconies were safe to build, safe to occupy, safe for a person to stand on with their morning coffee and look out at 5th Street. At the bottom of the page, beside a raised embossed seal, was Maren's name, her license number, a signature that was almost, but not quite, hers. "I didn't do this," Maren said. It wasn't a question. She knew her own hand. "I know," Ivy said quietly. "There are 5 more. I checked the permit archive going back 3 years. Every building with cantilevered balconies or load-bearing modifications, every one, has your stamp on it. You haven't done a single project for this company since you left 7 years ago." Maren picked up the drawing and held it under the mechanical room's single bare bulb, the way she'd once been taught, in her first year out of engineering school, to hold a set of plans up to the light and ask them, silently, "Are you telling me the truth?" 7 years, she said. "How many buildings?" 6 that I've found. Maybe more I haven't." Outside, muffled through the mechanical room's cinderblack walls, she could hear the crowd applauding, the sound of scissors closing on ribbon, her father's voice rising in triumph over the sound of it. To understand what it meant to Maren, standing in that mechanical room, it helps to understand what a professional engineering stamp actually is, not a formality, not a decoration, but a legal instrument. When Maren Ellis stamped a set of drawings, she was telling the state of her license, in language with real teeth, that she personally, professionally, and with everything her license was worth, believed those calculations were sound and that building was safe. If she was wrong, she could lose her license. If she was negligent, she could be sued. If she signed something she hadn't actually reviewed, she could be criminally prosecuted for professional fraud, not the company that used her name, necessarily, but her, specifically, personally, because the entire point of a license stamp was that it could be traced to exactly one human being who had agreed to stake their name on it. She had left Ellis Realty Group at 25, 3 years into her engineering career, after a disagreement with her father over a renovation on Colfax Street that she still thought about more than she liked to admit. Walter had wanted to remove a load-bearing wall to open up a floor plan for higher rent. Maren's calculations said the wall couldn't come out without a steel header the budget didn't allow for. Walter had told her, in front of Caleb and the contractor, that she was too cautious to ever build anything real, and had brought in another engineer, a semi-retired man named Frank Delacroix, who signed whatever he was asked to sign for a flat fee and never visited a job site if he could help it, to stamp the plans instead. She had quit within the month. She'd told herself, for 7 years, that quitting had been the end of it, that whatever her family built after that, however they built it, was no longer anything she had to carry. Standing in the mechanical room of the Birchwood, she understood that she had been wrong. They hadn't stopped needing her name. They had simply stopped asking for it. She drove home that night and sat at her kitchen table with her laptop until nearly 3 in the morning, pulling every public permit record she could find under her own license number. Ivy had found 6. Maren found 9 buildings, going back 4 years, each one bearing a signature close enough to hers that a city clerk stamping a permit at a busy counter would never think twice, each one a document that, if any of those balconies ever failed, would have her name, her actual, license-bearing, personally liable name, attached to the wreckage. She thought of Colfax Street. She thought of the wall Frank Delacroix had signed off on without ever visiting the site. She wondered, with a specific, sick unease that kept her up long past 3, how many of the 9 buildings had gotten the same treatment, how many corners Frank had waved through under her forged name, because it was faster and cheaper than doing the work she would actually have insisted on. She got her answer 4 days later, when a woman named Priya Anand called the firm where Maren now worked, asking to speak to the engineer who signed off on the balcony at 214 Larkin. Maren had never heard of the building. Priya's 12-year-old son had been standing on that balcony's railing 3 days earlier, reaching for a kite caught in a tree branch, when the railing gave way. He survived. He had a fractured pelvis, a concussion, and, according to the hospital, would need at least 2 surgeries. He had been 11 inches from the edge of a 4-story drop, when a downstairs neighbor's hedge broke his fall. Maren asked for the permit file that same afternoon. Her signature was on it. So was a load calculation that anyone with a first-year engineering education could have identified as insufficient for a railing rated for public use. She did not cry in her office. She closed her laptop, walked to the parking garage, sat in her car for 11 minutes without starting the engine, and then drove to a bar she didn't usually go to, ordered a drink she didn't finish, and called the one person in her family who had never once, in 32 years, made her feel like a liability. Ivy Ellis was Maren's cousin, 6 years younger, the daughter of Walter's younger brother, who had died when Ivy was 19 and left her, functionally, an orphan absorbed into Walter and Diane's household in a way that had always struck Maren as more transactional than tender, a niece taken in partly out of obligation, partly because a smart, hard-working young woman, who felt she owed the family something, made an extremely useful permitting coordinator, and asked for very little in return. Maren had always liked Ivy. She had never quite realized, until the week after the ribbon cutting, how much Ivy had been quietly absorbing on the company's behalf, how many permit applications she'd filed, knowing, on some level she'd trained herself not to examine too closely, that the engineer of record listed on them hadn't actually reviewed the work. I found Frank's invoices, Ivy told her, the 2 of them sitting in Ivy's car in a grocery store parking lot, the only place Ivy had felt safe meeting where no one from the family might see them. He gets paid $200 a stamp. He doesn't visit sites. He doesn't run calculations. Your Uncle Walter, sorry, my uncle, your dad, sends him the drawings and a check, and Frank sends back a stamp. Except it's not his stamp. Someone in the office scans your actual seal from an old set of drawings you did before you left, and reuses it. Frank just signs the transmittal cover sheet, so if anyone ever asks, there's a licensed engineer's name attached to the paperwork trail. He probably doesn't even know whose seal is actually on the drawings underneath his signature. Who does the scanning? Ivy was quiet for a long moment. I don't know for certain. I have a guess. I don't want to say it until I'm sure, because once I say it, I can't unsay it. Maren understood, without being told, that the guess was Caleb, that somewhere in the 7 years since she'd left, her brother had learned exactly how to make a building look legal without doing the part where it actually was. I'm not going to ask you to be the one who tells anyone this, Maren said. I need you to understand that whatever I do next, it's going to be bad for the company. Possibly criminal bad. I need to know if that's something you can live with, because you're the one who has to keep working there while it happens, or decide not to. Ivy looked out the windshield at the grocery store's automatic doors sliding open and shut for a woman pushing a cart. I filed a permit 2 years ago for a building where I know, because I checked the file again last week, the header calculations were wrong. I filed it because your father told me it was fine, and I believed him, because he's my uncle, and because believing him was easier than double-checking a licensed engineer's math. Her voice caught, just slightly. A kid almost died in a building with your name on it, Maren, because I filed paperwork I should have questioned. I don't get to decide. This isn't my problem anymore. I decided that the day I filed it, whether I meant to or not. Maren did not confront her father. She understood, with the same clarity she brought to every set of drawings she'd ever reviewed, that a private confrontation would accomplish nothing except giving Walter Ellis time to shred a filing cabinet and coach a story. What she needed instead was a body with actual authority to pull a license, freeze a permit, and open an investigation that no family dinner could talk its way out of. She filed a complaint with the State Board of Professional Engineers first, not a lawyer, not a reporter, the board itself, the body that had issued her license 7 years earlier, and had the legal authority to investigate exactly this kind of forgery. She brought 9 sets of drawings, 9 permit filings, a signature analysis from a forensic document examiner she'd hired privately, and the piece that made the investigator across the table go very quiet when she laid it on top of the file, the hospital records for a 12-year-old boy with a fractured pelvis, cross-referenced against a load calculation that had never once been performed by anyone qualified to perform it. "This isn't really an engineering complaint," the investigator told her, after a long silence. "This is a criminal referral. I'm required to send it to the Attorney General's office alongside our own inquiry." "I know," Maren said. "I read the statute before I came in." She filed a second, parallel complaint with the city's Department of Buildings, requesting an emergency structural review of every property in her list, a request that, under the city code, triggered a mandatory inspection hold on any pending certificates of occupancy, including, as it happened, the one the Birchwood was still waiting on for its top 2 floors, unrented and unfinished, representing roughly $11 million in projected revenue Walter had already spent, on paper, in front of investors at a ribbon cutting 3 weeks earlier. Ivy resigned from Ellis Realty Group the same week, walking her own signed, notarized statement into the Attorney General's office before anyone in the family knew what Maren had filed, not because Maren asked her to, but because, as she put it in a text Maren still had saved, "I'd rather be the one who told the truth first than the one who got asked why she didn't." The board suspended Maren's license for 90 days pending its own investigation into whether she'd been negligent in monitoring the use of her seal, a formality she'd expected and that stung anyway, a small, bureaucratic injury layered on top of a much larger one, the particular unfairness of being punished, even briefly, for a crime committed against her. It was lifted, fully and with a formal letter of exoneration, 6 weeks later, once the forensic signature analysis and Frank Delacroix's own panicked, fully cooperative statement to investigators made clear exactly whose forgery this actually was. Frank Delacroix surrendered his license voluntarily rather than fight the board's findings, a 71-year-old man who told investigators, according to the transcript Maren later read with a strange, hollow feeling that wasn't quite satisfaction, that he'd told himself for years it was basically paperwork, that the drawings were probably fine, that he'd never actually looked closely enough to know whether they were fine or not, because looking closely had never once been part of what he was being paid $200 to do. Caleb was charged with 9 counts of professional forgery, and 1 count of reckless endangerment tied to the Larkin Street railing. He took a plea deal that spared him trial, but not prison, 18 months, reduced from a maximum exposure his lawyer described to the press as significantly higher, a sentence Maren read about first in a news alert on her phone rather than from anyone in her family, because by the time the plea was entered, no one in her family was speaking to her at all. Walter was not criminally charged. The forgery itself had been executed, according to the investigation, primarily by Caleb, with Walter's knowledge, but not his own hand on the stamp, a legal distinction that meant a great deal to a jury and very little to Maren. What he lost instead was the company itself. Ellis Realty Group's contractor's license was revoked by the state licensing board 6 months after the first complaint, following an audit that turned up structural deficiencies in 4 of the 9 buildings serious enough to require immediate tenant relocation, funded, per an emergency court order, entirely out of Walter's own remaining assets. The Birchwood's top 2 floors were never rented. The chandelier in the lobby was repossessed by the leasing company that had financed it, unbolted from the ceiling on a Tuesday afternoon, while a single remaining tenant watched from the mail room and later described the sound of it, in a comment on a local news story, as like something finally being told the truth about itself. Diane called Maren exactly once, 4 months into the investigation, not to apologize, but to ask, in a voice gone thin and strange, whether there was anything at all Maren could do to keep Caleb's sentence from becoming public record, for the sake of the family name. Maren listened to the entire message twice before deleting it, and did not call back. Priya Annan's son recovered enough, by the following spring, to walk without a cane, though he still favored his left leg slightly on stairs, a detail Maren learned not from Priya directly, but from a card Priya sent her that winter, unprompted, unexpected, a single handwritten line that Maren kept in the same drawer where she'd once kept a photograph of a lake house that, in this particular version of her life, had never existed, because her family had never once been in the business of lake houses or Christmas mornings or velvet box necklaces. Her family had been in the business of buildings, and what they had built, in the end, without ever quite meaning to, was a very precise, very legally documented record of exactly how little they had ever actually cared what happened to the people who lived inside the things they sold. Thank you for telling the truth even though it must have cost you something, the card read. My son is walking again. I hope wherever your work takes you next, people trust it the way I now trust yours. Maren left the firm where she'd been working and started her own small practice the following year. 3 employees, a modest office above a bakery, and a policy, printed and framed on the wall where every client could see it before they signed a contract, that she personally inspected every site she stamped, no exceptions, no delegated seals, no shortcuts, because she had learned, in the most expensive way a person can learn something, exactly what it cost when a signature stopped meaning the thing it was supposed to mean. She ordered a new physical seal for her practice, the old digital file, the one that had been scanned and copied and reused 9 times without her knowledge, permanently retired, reported to the board as compromised, replaced with a new registration number entirely. The new seal sat in a locked drawer in her desk, and she was, for the first time in longer than she could remember, the only person on earth who had access to it. She did not reconcile with her father. She exchanged a handful of stilted, practical emails with her mother over the following 2 years, mostly logistics, a storage unit that needed clearing out, a signature required on an old joint account, none of it warm, none of it something either of them pretended was more than it was. She saw Caleb once, at the very end of his sentence, in a visiting room she drove 3 hours to sit in for 40 minutes, not because she'd forgiven him, but because Ivy had asked her to, gently, without pressure, and Maren had found, to her own mild surprise, that she wanted to see for herself whether there was anything left in him worth eventually, someday, cautiously trying to know again. There wasn't, not yet. He spent most of the 40 minutes explaining, in a tone that still carried traces of the boardroom confidence he'd once worn like a second suit, why none of it had really been his fault. Maren listened, said very little, and drove home in silence, and did not go back a second time. Ivy, though, Ivy she saw every week. Ivy had gone back to school at 26 for her own engineering degree, on a partial scholarship Maren had helped her find, and when the scholarship didn't quite cover everything, quietly, unglamorously helped fund the rest of herself, the way you might repair a load-bearing wall you'd once watched someone else remove without the header it needed, not as a debt owed, not as an obligation inherited, but simply because it was the right calculation to make, and because Maren had learned, finally, what it felt like to build something with a person who checked her math instead of asking her to sign off on someone else's. Ivy interned at Maren's firm the summer before her final year of school. On her last day, she asked Maren, half joking, whether she'd ever designed the seal Ivy would eventually get to use. You'll design your own, Maren told her. That's the whole point of it. Nobody hands you a seal that means something. You earn the right to put your name on things, and then you spend the rest of your career making sure it was worth earning, and you never, under any circumstances, let anyone else hold the stamp for you. Not even someone you love. Especially not someone you love, because they are the ones who'll ask you for it first. Ivy wrote that down, on the back of an old business card, and kept it pinned above her own desk for the rest of engineering school, not as a photograph with someone else's handwriting claiming to know who she was, but as a sentence she'd chosen for herself, from someone who'd finally learned the difference between the two.